You're listening to episode 166 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Today we speak with John Taylor about his life and work changing the conversation about diversity in mindfulness communities and teaching institutions. As mindfulness continues to become more and more integrated into contemporary society, it faces a growing awareness of the relationship between non-duality and the realities faced in everyday life. Can we really extinguish suffering without facing, acknowledging, and working with the external causes and conditions of that suffering, not just for us, but for others? Inequities, privilege, bias all play a part in daily life too, and mindfulness may not be living up to its full potential without rolling up its sleeves, our sleeves, on those realities. John Taylor is a certified MBSR teacher with a long meditation and retreat practice. He's an active member of the Greater Richmond community, where the primary focus of his work has been on racial equity and reconciliation initiatives, as well as facilitated community dialogues. He's currently serving on the board of the Richmond Peace Education Center, One Common Unity, based in Washington, D.C., and an advisory committee for the Chrysalis Institute, where he teaches mindfulness. John has also been a food security activist who initiated urban farming programs in Newark, New Jersey. John is a graduate of the College of Worcester and lives in North Chesterfield, Virginia, with his wife, 3 children, and 3 dogs. Our guest today is John Taylor. John, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Ted. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. And I want to say a little bit about that in a little bit, but I'd like to start with having you tell us a little bit about your journey and what it was that has brought you to mindfulness and keeps you in it.
Yeah. Wow. That is an interesting, sort of question to ponder because, there can be a direct sort of like, this is what primary thing in this house, but, naturally it begins, long before that. Right. And so I had an interesting sort of entry into the world. My mom was engaged to my biological father and then decided we're going to break this off, right? And so she got him off, and yet she was pregnant with me. And she was in grad school at that time, studying social work, and got into a feud with her father, who was a big city lawyer in Detroit, Michigan. And she was determined, I'm going to take care of all of this on my own, right? And so in the first 6 months, I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, because she was not, in communication with her parents, and particularly her dad. And the first 3 months, I was in a foster home while she was studying. And then the next 3 months, I was in Detroit, Michigan, where my grandparents lived. And that was at an orphanage, right? For women in similar situations. I mean, this was a time where there was major sort of upset around, babies born out of wedlock. And so um, it was my grandfather's church, was this big Baptist church. And so I was there for 3 months. And my grandmother, who was African American, and yet still there was a connection to Native American culture, where her great grandmother, no, her grandmother was Native American from here, from Virginia.
Mhm.
And so she was a social worker in town. Um, and this being still segregated, I was born in 64. Um, and so the community was tight in a way. And so that combination of the African American close knit community, her being a social worker, her being very in touch with her sort of Native American roots, she had an inkling that there was something wrong. And so the story is this: she ran there, grabbed me out of that place, took me to the doctor in tears, and the doctor was like, "This is a healthy baby boy at 6 months." And so I was raised for the next 2.5 years with my grandparents. And as I came to be, I came to understand them as my parent. You're all are my parents, right? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
And my mom and sisters were my siblings, is my understanding. And my grandmother, when she could, she would teach, spirituality, to me. And it was primarily based within, the Christian tradition, but not completely. She was like in and out of that because of her own sort of life experience. And so that was the first sort of kind of like inkling that there was something else, that she was the first person to kind of have those conversations with this toddler, really, that I can recall. Um, and then the story developed later about why she came running in there, but we can maybe come back to that. And so from then on, I went to live with my mom and father, who adopted me, who I now know as my dad. And then it became more of an intellectual sort of exercise, really, like spirituality and religion. And by the time I was 5, we started attending this Presbyterian church. One, because that was the tradition of my mother's family, on the women's side, and and it was a prestigious sort of Protestant, understood, welcome idea. So my dad was like, sure, him being more industrious and sort of, the former salesperson, that's like, that could be a great way to kind of connect, interestingly, as Presbyterian churches go, it was seen as an integrated church. It was kind of like one of those really unique kind of things, where there was, a diverse group of people, African Americans, Asians, Latin, American folk, primarily white, but there was that aspect to it. But that was really more intellectual to me. I never really kind of got the feeling. I would sit in the various things that they had us all do. And I never kind of like got it, right? It was never, nothing really turned on in a way. And I remember, for example, in the 3rd grade, and they're talking about the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I was like, so this New Testament, is based on what happened nearly 2,000 years ago, and a few hundred years later, they kind of wrote it up. And it's like, that seems kind of old as well. When's the New Testament coming out, And the teachers just kind of looked at me like blankly, like, okay, But anyway, so that was all sort of intellectual. My mom, was having whatever kind of issues that caused her to dig deeper. And this memory kind of like got triggered while I was teaching MBSR.
Mm.
And I was like, wait a minute, that was a body scan, right? She had tapes. And so, she was doing this body scan thing. Um, and there was a book that accompanied it that talked about the raising exercise. I read the book from cover to cover, like as a 12-year-old, or maybe a little bit older. And I snuck in the room when she was doing the body scan, right? And I'm just like crawling around the space and, curious what this is all about. But it's really more about sort of like an intellectual. I was really I read a lot, and mom's really into this. And okay, cool. Um, I also did camping experiences. So I would be away for weeks at a time in northern, Connecticut at first, and then up into the um, New Hampshire, area at a camp that was old school camp that was nothing, soft and fluffy about it, right? It was, you're in these, like cabins in the woods, and we're going to take you on these experiences for weeks for like a week or weeks at a time, hiking, canoeing, bicycling through Nova Scotia. And so I came to get sort of an idea, being out in nature, um, of another kind of awareness. And so, so when people would point to spiritual experiences, I would point to those kinds of things. And spirituality, I was basically looking for evidence that I could feel, right, as well. And then, there was, interesting television shows. I think it was Leroy, no, Nimoy, the guy who played Spock.
Leonard Nimoy.
Leonard Nimoy, thank you. And so he had this show where he was exploring unusual, sorts of phenomena,
Mm-hmm.
And then he talked about, he had all these interviews with near-death experiences, NDE folk, right? And that made sense to me. I was like, okay, all right. And so they had this incredible experience of kind of meeting with something that was extraordinary, while they were in that. And so I was kind of like, okay, I can kind of accept that. That seems to make sense to me, and I explored that a little bit. But again, it was all intellectual. By the time I get to college, I became really interested because I grew up after this sort of interesting few years. My parents did really well, for the African Americans. My dad was a corporate executive for several companies at the very highest levels, throughout New York, New Jersey. My mom was a social worker and did very well with Connecticut schools, and so lived comfortably. My mom kind of coming out of that upper middle class. Granddad was a lawyer, and mom was a social worker in Detroit. And so my existence was this sort of upper middle class, very comfortable, existence. When I went to college, they were like, within the first few days, they're like, shaking. It's like, there's more than that bubble, you're up in, within weeks. And so I really began to kind of question, how society is put together. And that was, coming from lots of different perspectives, became a history major, and then became really super concerned about all of the various injustices in the world. This would have been 80s, right? And it came to a point where all of that injustice, led to just a great deal of suffering on my part, of kind of like, what do you do with this world that is, a disaster, not, you know, um, disastrous in so many ways, right? And just led to like an incredible amount of anguish, for me as well. and not just, in terms of race, but, the economics of it, race and class, and all these, things. South Africa was still under apartheid, and I had South African friends, one in particular that I was very close to, um, and, hearing that struggle. So anyway, so that all of that was happening. And by that time, I'd really become more of an agnostic, you know. I still held out the belief that there's something, right? Like those NDEs. I'm sure there's, when we die, I'm sure there's going to be some interest, but otherwise I didn't. Um, I just didn't have an idea. And I lived in this very much of a mind-based intellectual, world. And yeah. Um, and so kind of the kicker there was not really having a way to fully explore that. Um, you know, I tried the counseling, and they were really into like, that kind of like emergency situation and get you out of it, like an ongoing thing. It was like, okay, so this is not really helpful. um, and I ended up being really depressed, and then kind of like in a space of, I was there an extra semester to finish up some work. And I was just really, everything was kind of dark, and started to consider suicide. Um, and I remember, um, coming back to my house, I was living off campus, and just kind of like, well, I don't really see, any sort of, purpose to any of this, right? And then sort of this voice that kind of like, I had no idea where it was coming from, but it was like, no, no, you have so much to do. There's so much that you have to offer. And it shook me to a place of kind of like, it just got me out of that mode. And I was like, whoever that is, looking around, who the hell is talking here, but it was convincing enough that it broke me out of that. And I became, very sort of regimented in my days and kind of like getting through things. But it wasn't enough to kind of like really cause a breakthrough, because, at that time I had developed an addiction to marijuana. But not being, it's interesting because cannabis isn't habit forming in a way chemically, but it can be in other ways, right?
Yeah.
And so having that sort of like hole of kind of like, and not really tools to deal with that, it became apparent to me, right, that I needed to deal with that issue, right? And so I had friends that were going to 12-step meetings, and who had invited me to come. And I was like, intellectually, I was like, wow, that would be great, in the past. But I was like, now it's like, so I think I might have an issue, right? And I went to my first 12-step meeting. And, I'm a person that could usually talk my way in and out of a box, as the deans of the school were kind of like describing it at some project that I was working on. And I'm sitting here in Akron, Ohio, with working class folks, firemen, mechanics, line people. When there was still industry in the United States back in the 80s. People that I wasn't around, College of Worcester, being quite the prestigious, little Midwestern liberal arts school. And they were speaking so eloquently, about their various situations. And when it came to me, this possessor of words, I just stumbled over everything and just kind of like, and they were like, keep coming back. Like, like, okay, great. you know. And then I remember I picked up a pamphlet, and it had 50 different ways where, addiction might be an issue, for you. And so, people are trying to be nice to me and whatever. I'm like, I'm reading right now. I really need to read this. And I got through all 50, and 25 of them were kind of like, yeah, this kind of fits. So like, 50-50 here, right? And I turned the pamphlet over and says, if you have three or more of these, you might be an addict, right? Essentially is what it said. And I was like, oh my God. And so um and so that was I fit that definition to a T, right? At the time. And so my good friend, who was so skillful, right? Because he didn't, he just was, he just invited, and it was just a kind of, it could be something, instead of saying, dude, you are the biggest addict ever, right? Actually super skillful. Um, and when I came home that afternoon, super exhausted and just kind of like mind blown, um, I said a prayer, which I didn't do much, but I learned how to pray a little bit, Um, and it was just asking for help, you know, and just a whole nother world opened up at that point, and I had this, image of God being feminine and brown and humongous and just kind of like holding me, welcoming me, and it was like they're there. It's going to be okay, you know. And I was like, wow. And I fell asleep, and I was like, okay. And so it was a real sort of eye-opening awareness that something else was possible. And I should mention, shortly before that time, months before, um, I went on a spring break trip to have fun in Florida, right? And it was a friend's house. She was, very well-off parents, on some intercoastal yada yada whatever on an island, and a beautiful home. And we get there, and we're like, we're gonna learn Reiki, right? And I was like, great, whatever that is, I'm game, sure. And she was one of the rare sort of Reiki masters that were around. That was kind of when they were still kind of following lineage and all that. And she taught us Reiki, and um, that was really incredible to kind of like actually feel energy in a way, and to play around with that um, modality. It was kind of like, and I could actually feel the energy. And they talked about universal energy. I learned how to meditate in that space. And then I would have these incredible experiences. Like, we came back after that, and um, I had a friend who had scratched her eye to such a point where it was completely closed, and she maybe needed an operation or something of that nature. And I'm explaining Reiki, and she says, "Can you do it to me now?" And I was like, "Yeah." And so I did, Reiki. I followed the energy up and down and whatever. About 20 minutes later, I said, okay, I think that's it. I felt the rise in energy in the fall, and she was, her pain went from a 7 to a 2, and her eye opened up, and the next day the patch was gone, right? And so it was like, that was the evidence also that I needed, right? To kind of like, I need to feel this, I need to see it, I need to, all the rest of that, you know, um, that there is something more in the world, that there is, um, you know, say that, it altered my agnostic sort of point of view, as well. So all that was like around the 21, 22 age. Um, And, I explored Reiki further. Um, my friend was graduating at that time as well, and she came back and we had a long conversation, and she trained me a little bit more in that, field as well in that. And so that gave me a base of understanding, a jumping off point to kind of like begin to look into, kind of in a survey way, the different religious traditions from the East. But I had that direct experience, right? And so that's when my meditation practice began. Um, and it dovetailed really well with 12 steps because, 12 steps is essentially based on Christian understandings and taking out the religious, and here are the practices to do. And so I followed that path for a while, and I was really into um, understanding healing. And so I would read the various books on that and practice on family. Um, and it really gave me such an opening um, that um, that really served me well, in the years to come. Okay, so how does this relate to mindfulness? And um, so coming back, I had kind of like waned back and forth from, sort of this interest in healing. And I learned this, like went from Reiki to quantum touch, which explores this, explores meditation, explores energy in a myriad of ways, right? Other than that. So that kind of like introduced me even more deeply into practice. Um, but that would kind of like come and go. And so, we were struggling, you know, our way in the world. My wife was, studying at every university, you know, and and so like the kind of real life, the sort of real life realities, like you got to make money, we got to do this and that and the other would kind of come in, and then also the justice issues were remaining kind of like to the, very to the core. So cutting a number of years to more of the present. Um, in 2014, we moved to Virginia. And the idea of, like, my wife had finished her studies. Um, I was ready to leave the job that I had at that time at a retreat center in New York. And my parents were in Williamsburg, an hour from here. So it was like, great, let's move, to Virginia. I got to work at the Initiatives of Change organization, which is a international organization. And interestingly, it was born at the same time Alcoholics Anonymous was born. And so they were part of that Oxford group that was there. And one branch went, the 12 steps, and the other went into this Initiatives of Change world, kind of like the understanding of the 12 steps is for the person, and then Initiatives of Change was supposed to be about healing humanity in a way, right? Some have kind of like, it's had its cultish days, it had some kind of issues along the way, which I think that they addressed. But anyway, so I ended up at the national office of the US, which happened to be in Richmond. Was, one of the things that they do is the community trust building fellowship. And this is 5 weeks, 5 months, and a long weekends, every month. And the first weekend it's like discovering what is your why, right? And, how you kind of operate in the world. And so they brought us through all these various exercises. And at that time, like justice, community, community building, Um, that kind of thing was where my interest was, um, as well as like working with race, and understanding that to a greater degree. So all of those sort of things, very, very intellectual, um, there were where I thought I'd end up, as being my core. But the core instead was like a spiritual base, right? And that was like really surprising to me, right? Because I'd gone full bore like into this intellectual, and I was like, what? I'm still that guy, you know? Um, and it was just really eye opening and shook me for months. Um, but there was another gentleman who had retired um, from the school district, young, and a similar thing happened to him, and we found each other and we're like, dude, what are we going to do with this discovery? How do we actualize this, in a way? And we're talking back and forth, and I was kind of like shrugging my shoulders, and I'm like, well, what about mindfulness, as a way to kind of like, as a vehicle to kind of help people um, bring this spiritual nature in a way to folks, and have that be a central sort of motivating place. So anyway, it was kind of like this mindfulness thing. It was on Time magazine, whatever that is. I didn't really know what it was, right? And it took about a year for me to meet with a director of what's called the Inner Work Center now, here in Richmond. Um, and part of that was because my friends from, all of my Richmond friends were kind of like, nah, the Inner Work Center, it's this bunch of like rich white ladies from the West End that don't want to go to church anymore, right? I was like, so they were discouraging me from, like, you don't want to mess with them. But then they hired their first executive director, who's this young um, Jewish, queer, um, a sort of nonprofit um, guru, if you will, right? Very, very skilled. And she's like, why do you want me to do this? And whatever it was compelling, for her. So I was like, that's interesting, people, that she's there, and they're like, I don't know why she's there. So, so finally, I'm sitting at a luncheon next to her mother-in-law, right? And the mother-in-law is like, yeah, you should meet Rachel. It'll be great. And I was like, okay, so finally, I'm going to meet this new director. And why my impetus was organization. It's like maybe your organization, how my organization that's kind of like stuck in the Christian paradigm only, they value silence, and it's like sit in silence. And I was like, well, can we sit in silence more skillfully? How about that? And so I was like, so I was coming for her to kind of like help us move the ball, She thought I was coming for me, right? And so we kind of like were missing each other, but let's meet in a couple of weeks. Right? And so the next time she came armed with sort of how mindfulness can be useful within communities, and in particular within the different projects of African American communities, and some of the things that were happening, there. And I was like, okay, just eyes wide open. And we're talking back and forth. And I asked her, I said, can I learn how to do this? Can I learn how to be a facilitator for this sort of thing? And she literally like jumped 3 feet out of her chair and up and down. And she was like, yes, yes, you can. Right. Because, I mean, for her, she wanted to move out of this sort of upper middle class, exclusive, area. And if she can get, somebody like me, involved. And so, again, sort of a long story short, me and the other gentleman, we were invited to take a mindful self-compassion class. And we did, and it was amazing. Um, one thing that comes to mind with that is like, your inner voice, your inner critic, that kind of thing. And for me, it was, you know, not as explicitly like horrible as like some of my other classmates, but it was politically correct, right? It knew, that inner voice, not to really come down on me, because that's not really useful, but it was still needed a lot of work, right? And so that really helped me to kind of address that. And I was like, okay, so this is good. And other thing, so cutting to the present, right, really quickly, me and my other friend from Richmond, he was invited to come back to the school district and lead the entire district in mindfulness practices, setting up mindfulness rooms in all the schools. And so it's become this model, for the other schools that are there. So that's the direction that he, went in. And for me, and what I'm doing now. And so I then got a number of mentors from the Inner Work Center to sit with, to have conversations with, to explore different things. And we decided that the route that we should go is MBSR. That's the core from which other things have sprung, but that's the would be the core program. And it's like, do you want to do it in Massachusetts or San Diego? We've done most of the training in San Diego, and it's like, yeah, San Diego sounds good. And then there was these prerequisites, as well. And one was a 5-day silent retreat, right? And I was like, can I get out? I don't want to do that. It's like, no, it's important.
You got to do that.
Yeah, do it. You got to do it. It's important. And I was like, oh man. So I went through like the various morning, stages, that you do, kind of having to sit, because not really realizing that I had done, half days or 3/4 of a day silent retreat, and I survived, but me being this like extroverted extrovert, when I brought the idea to my friends, they're like, "Hey, no way you're going to be able to sit for 5 days, right? There's no way."
In silence, can't happen.
So I went on YouTube and saw people survive 10-day, silent retreats, and I was like, me being, in my early 50s, been around the planet a few times, I could do anything for 5 days. What could be so horrible? And so I did, and it ended up being one of my very favorite things in the world to do, right? And it was a fascinating sort of space to kind of just be on my own with 50 other people, but on my own, and to kind of hear what was going on, internally, as well. And boy, I mean, it was this cacophony, right? It was just like, oh my God, it's so much noise,
yep.
And it, and one was the, different personalities that came up. And so the storyteller, and so this constant sort of like, okay, I'm going to tell, family and friends all about this. And so that storyteller was there. And then there's a comedian kind of making fun of different things. And then there was, the self-doubter, and there was like all of these. And I was like, my goodness, so it's just fascinating experience. And I came away being like, that is so killer. Everybody needs to do this, when they're ready. And then a few weeks later, I went to teacher training in September of 2017, somewhere north of the San Francisco Bay Area, Earthrise, I think,
That's where I finished up my teacher training. It's a beautiful, beautiful center.
Yeah. And then some of your colleagues, were there leading, and that was fascinating in its way. And I had this like incredible experience because I decided to leave Initiatives of Change to work where I am now, which is called Side by Side, that works with LGBTQ plus youth throughout Virginia. And so I was changing jobs, and the old boss sent me this, like an email while I'm sitting there, and it was like about having to do with, some of the compensation issues, right? So it was one of these experiences of like, like everything being turned on. Oh my God, I'm not gonna have any money, like the kind of freak out moment, right when Susan is going over something similar, right? I think it was difficult, difficult experiences or whatever, like not pleasant, but challenging, experiences. And that happened right there, right? So it's like, as I went around the class, I said, I have something for you right here. And, what that demonstrated was this whole idea of a number of things, kind of like impermanence, because I was freaking out, but then that kind of came to a crest and fell. I didn't, like seek to be distracted. I sat with those uncomfortable feelings, right?
Mhm.
And then I also start to really kind of get the idea of the pattern. In similar kind of situations, there is a similar curve of discomfort to feeling back into an equilibrium again. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really cool. So that's just one example. It was this great example all week of kind of like aha moments. And then I started co-teaching that by early 2018. And part of the challenge with that is where the incredible cost to kind of like support moving through the program.
Yeah.
And but my wife and I were doing well, but we also have 3 kids, like in college. And in between stage, so it was like our kids and then my parents who were their health challenges are starting to pile up. And I was like, I don't know how I can do this. And so the Inner Work Center, they're like, well, let's figure this out. And so they developed a whole program, because of my kind of like not being able to really afford this, So they developed a scholarship program, not only for me, but for other folks to make the various trainings available, for folks, right? Yeah, and so that allowed me to really start working with mentors and really kick it off. And so I did all of my 22 hours, and Beth had then become Beth Mulligan become the leader at UC San Diego Mindfulness Center. And to understand, to where she was at that time, she's like, we really need to have a greater diversity, and she's looking around. She's like, we're a bunch of white middle class women, that teach this. It's like, and this is not acceptable. And so, at the same time, this idea of really kind of working, with intention to have POC folk, people of color, like in the space. And at the same time, one of her friends who had a relationship with the Katali Foundation had the same idea. So they came together, and wrote for funds to do such a thing, and was accepted. And so she's like, okay, so we got to find people of color, to do this. Who's there, And my co-teachers, here, they were obviously further along, and they were doing their ATTI with Beth. And Beth is like, had met someone in a TTI from Richmond, who has an incredible background and already pretty solid. And she's like, I could work with her. And they're like, you need to get to know John Taylor, right? And so then Beth and I began to talk about all of this, and um, yeah, we really began to do this work. And so, yeah,
And that brings us to now. So,
bring yeah,
well, a few things on this. First, John, thank you so much for that candid reflection on what brought you to this moment in your background with mindfulness in your life. Because all of that, what's wonderful about what you shared is how all of these threads, these different conditions, are dynamic, they're changing. Wait, I'm not a spiritual person. Holy buckets, maybe I am, and all the rest of that, and influenced by things like In Search Of. Right? So you get a gold star for bringing up In Search Of, because I used to watch that too with Leonard Nimoy,
yeah,
and all of these different things, which just show how we're a dynamic process and a constant unfolding, and that is really at the heart of mindfulness, is the exploration of that as it is occurring. And so what brought us together here for folks who are listening to this is probably a couple months ago, as of this recording, there was a session that we were both on with a number of other teachers from all over the world. And Beth, and hi Beth, I know you're listening, is a dear friend. And in one of the parts where people were sharing, I was moderating this and called on you, and you talked a bit about some of the diversity work that you're doing associated with the folks at UCSD and our colleagues there. And that immediately reignited a fire that had been smoldering for a while, as I've taken a bit of a break from podcasting and haven't been putting the spotlight on this stuff as much as I usually do around diversity, because as you described, and as I have seen in various contemplative communities in different kinds of contexts, it tends to be folks who are more affluent, and that affluent tends to come from being white, at least in the United States. And that's not good. It's not healthy, because it's not representative of what the country makeup actually is. And so while it is the words you said about looking around, we need to find some people of color, and like that is a very real thing. That is a very real challenge, because the roots of this and how it has grown in this way has been more reserved for folks who have the extra money to do these retreats and take this kind of training. It's over $10,000 to become a teacher, and that's an inhibitor, let alone taking the time off. If you're a single parent, or your job is not one where you're flush with lots of cash to be able to spend that, these are the kinds of challenges that exist. It's not just about, here's a scholarship, that's great, that's wonderful, but it's also providing some discrimination by itself. and it's more than just the tuition, it's also time off and all this other stuff. There are lots of conditions in there. And so I immediately even sent a note that you may not have seen in the chat on that meeting, so I really want to talk to you. Here's my email address. So glad we did finally connect. And again, thanks to Beth for making that connection a little more clear, because we are connected externally anyway. But I want to talk about, and this is really the heart of our conversation today, is your work around what you described there. And how do we make this shift from where we are today and historically have been, which is something reserved for people of affluence, typically people who are white, and have this more accessible to everyone, because it's about being human. It's not about being affluent.
right.
And that is one of the challenges of how do we get from here to there. So what have you been doing? What has that work been? What's that work been like for you in the exploration of, what are the conditions that led to this, and how do we change them?
Yeah, no, it's very, very interesting. And on the national or international sort of scale. Um, and and that work first began, for me here at the local center, the Interwork Center. And, very much this idea, that we're living in a city that is essentially 50-50, Richmond City, of, African American and white, and the organization not representing that. And no. And so, and a new director and a board that wanted to move in a direction that was not this sort of like club for other women, this internal sort of, um, search for meaning, right? So they had done that over a number of decades, and then they're like, well, maybe there's something that we can offer by opening up, to the community, and offer and also learn. So with this new executive director, she says, we need to make this, accessible. We need to make this relevant, to the rest of our community as well. Um, and she worked with board members, she worked with other supporters. She, she saw me and she did what she did, as I described there as well. Um, and that was my intention, as well. It's like this seems to be, something that is mostly exclusively, for other folks, and yet there's a great deal of suffering, throughout our world, and not just within, where there is obvious historical issues with race, but that suffering is something that is that I've seen, in my, I grew up in Westchester, New York, right, which is known for being a very comfortable bedroom suburb of New York. But it's obviously more complex than that. But it's really to begin to make things available to more. And so we were doing that at the Interwork Center, of having more and more representation, reaching out as well. It becomes easier, right? If I'm on the program as an African American, for other African Americans to be like, oh, is that a thing? Right. And so it was that sort of like community building, one person at a time kind of thing. To whereas today, I mean, there might have been a couple of people on the board that were African American, a few of us around, but today it is completely different. The executive, well, the chair of our board is an African American woman now. I'm on the board as well, and it's the organization is really changing, very quickly. Um, and so there was that, kind of like reaching out that I was a part of, and a part of it is just kind of like my presence, doing NBSR, doing some of the other things that they did as well. Um, and so on the national scale, with Beth's impetus, the idea was to have a cohort for TTI that was really POC focused, well, or BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, um, as well. And it became the diverse communities in title. And so there was a few white folks in there because the world is, our world is diverse in that way. And so there were other white participants, but we had this long ramp up to actually of time where folks were identified. And so we started having a sort of community, a sangha, if you will, where we'd meet monthly and lead through practices and just get to know folks. And then COVID hit as well. So that became more important. And we were going to do this obviously live and in person, but couldn't do that either. And so, yeah, we had our cohort this summer so I think it was 24 or so folks that were from diverse communities, African American, Asian, Latin American, as well. And Beth built a what she calls a bench of teachers, that were also diverse. And it was this wonderful sort of um, experiment, kind of like not knowing what would happen as well. And there being, nothing is perfect, and so there was areas where we rubbed up against things, but overall, it was an incredible TTI. You know, similar to other TTIs. By that time, I'm being trained as a teacher trainer as well. So I'd done, I think that was my second one. Um, and the experience was incredibly rich. And now um, all of the people that continue with that cohort, I think a couple dropped away, have gone through the practicum, time as well. And some are beginning to teach. And one, I'm actually co-teaching with one of them, here in Richmond. Yeah.
Awesome.
Um, yeah. Yeah.
Co-teaching is
And,
so much fun.
yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. And it's the first time that I'm co-teaching as the more senior person. And
Yeah.
so that is like mind blowing in terms of like, how do I explain this now to you? And then I was like explaining the process of getting a mentor. And she's like, aren't you a mentor? And I'm like, yeah. She says, could you be my mentor? I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, that's
You
part
want
of
me
this process. The first
to?
time I did mentoring was co-teaching with someone who was going through the UCSD program,
Oh,
and that was just so delightful because it was also part of how I received mentoring at the Center for Mindfulness was co-teaching with others who had been doing this, and it was terrific because it's a chance, whichever seat you're in, as the newer person and seeing how others are doing it. Of course, you've been through class a few times, you've had the training, but it's different when you're in that seat.
oh my goodness.
And then
Yeah.
switching that around when you're the more senior person, and there is also yet another me that shows up. Like you described earlier when you're on retreat and these different personalities that are part of you, it's the same thing in class. Like, oh, here's the me that is also now has a responsibility of guidance and evaluation and encouragement, and how do I work with the things that maybe we can explore this, and how that can be even more effective in this other way. How about that? Tell me a little bit more here. And boy, just raising the bar on how we do inquiry in that way, in that seat.
Absolutely. And yeah, and it's I went from co-teaching to solo teaching. So I did a number of classes, on my own. And now me being the leader of the more senior person, I'm not really the leader at all. We're kind of like very conscious of presenting, an equal voice as we present, as we teach, as we facilitate. Um, but yeah, and we're in the midst of it, right? I mean, we've just finished our third class. Um, and one of the things that we're doing as well with the members of that cohort who were on the bench, as Beth says, we're now getting more training on how to do um, teacher training so that we can also um, be co-teachers with other folks, and to do that on the international basis, really. So
Yeah. Yeah, because much as having a fairly white audience or cohort of students who take an MBSR course as an example, and it's very, very white, you don't see a lot of people of color there, even more so in the teacher base. And that shift, so that's really one of the things I am very interested in and so happy to hear, is that there is this intention around welcoming BIPOC as the teacher side of it too, not just taking this course, but being able to spread that wide, because that presence, as you've noticed, your own presence makes a difference. That's what's going to really, really energize this shift that is inevitable anyway, but we can choose to make it happen sooner and well instead of just organically. That's great, but I want to water and, and nourish this too.
No, absolutely. And one of the things that kind of struck Beth was just this idea of like, one day she said, I don't ever, want to teach, with another white person again, right, in this way, right? I mean, it's just kind of like, this doesn't make any sense. And so, it was the person that she was working with at the Catali Foundation, Larry Young, who was like, "Oh, you're getting it," right?
Yeah.
As an Asian American and really sort of an activist, with this whole idea, right? And so yeah, so that was part of the motivation as well. And in terms of it making a difference, it's really interesting in that way, and who it affects. And so Mindful Leader was offering retreats and came to Beth to because she teaches so many retreats and became an expert at doing it over Zoom. So they approached her, and she asked me to co-teach or to co-lead with her. And having me on the brochure, there were white folks that were like, "Oh, like I want to sign up for that one," right? Because they value the diversity themselves. And clearly other brown folks, Black and brown folks, were like, okay, that makes it more interesting. Yeah. So, so I think
Leader is very committed to that, because they started their online MBSR a couple of years ago. I created that program with them and did teaching on how to teach mindfulness live online, did some of that with Beth, did some special sessions there. And Mindful Leader has been wonderfully. So just a shout out to Mo and Claire and Chelsea and that team on their interest in it, because of course they understand that this is open for everyone. So again, thanks to them for really being a leader in that.
Yeah. And so along the way to creating the BIPOC cohort, Beth was approached with the opportunity to work with gun violence survivors. And John Kabat-Zinn actually approached her, would you be interested in taking this on? And she, her first, response was, heck yeah. I was like, can you put together a team? She says, absolutely. And then she's like, after the phone call, okay, now I actually need to do this.
Now what?
Yeah. And so, she approached me and Karantima's here in Richmond to be part of that cohort. And then you probably know Saida or Saida as well. Yep. It's a name escapes me. And then Beth's husband, Hugh, we became the team to take on two cohorts for that program. And it's very interesting. I mean, life is messy, right? And so the idea was that we would have 40 or so people that had kind of been a little bit seasoned, right? Had kind of like worked through some of their issues, was the idea. That didn't happen. And so
and life laughed at us and said, no.
And so we had people that potentially may not be kind of like accepted into an MBSR 8-week course. And there's all sorts of ideas about how do we accommodate, the organization that we were working with to pull this together, and, all these conversations. And I finally said, look, we're MBSR teachers, facilitators. That is our lane, right? That is what we do. I've taught this, over a few years now, and I've seen the miraculous, the unexplainable, the unexpected, every class, and I think we can hold this space, right? They did have a couple of psychologists, counselors that attended class. In my case, they were just attending class like everybody else. And um, we were able to hold the space. We really were. And it was really fascinating. And it was a very diverse group of people as well. And what became apparent as well as with the Afro American participants, there's obviously going to be somewhat of a comfort, but then there's also the real reality of it is that we are a different culture. We do communicate in ways, we do move in ways, we have other sort of expectations that are very close being African American, but at the same time, they can have significant enough differences. And
Yeah,
so,
not just one culture.
right, exactly. Yeah. And so what was fascinating to me was how I was able to communicate with the different students in class or like outside of as well, or after, struggling with something. And, I could kind of like help them move in a way, just by a look, or by kind of like, what would take me, like another teacher, 40 words, I could do it in one,
Yeah.
because of the awareness and the um, life experience of being African American. And so um, that those two cohorts were also studies. And so UCSD decided they would kind of like do a study, which I'm not familiar with because I'm staying in my lane. I'm not a researcher, right? I was concerned with like, they didn't want me to also do the various things they wanted them to do, right? Which is like, samples of everything, right? Lots of, like even your bowel movement samples. I mean, it was everything. I was like, do I have to do that? And they're like, no, right? And I'm like, okay. And so I knew that this was happening, but they were handling that, and we heard along the way that we're getting some good results. And then the director of the center there, who had done the study, very interestingly, he was a new director, and he had some kind of like, okay, you're running a mindfulness center, but you have doubts about MBSR, really? Right? That's good. Okay. But it was great for him to have those doubts, because what came back in their studies kind of blew um, the parameters, the historical parameters out of the water in a way. I mean, the kind of results that they were getting all the way around. And so he was dumbfounded, and so he called this meeting. I didn't really realize what I thought it was going to be, this dry sort of thing. And he's like, "What in the world did you guys do?" And it's like, how are we getting these results? This is like, incredible. And I was like, really? I was like, okay. And Beth said the only thing really different, there was having POC people, in the space. It's the only thing that I can call that would be different, and perhaps, that was a contributing, factor.
Well, it can't not be. I find more and more is that the connection one has with the teacher, the other participants, that is very much a part of the program. It always has been. And the critics of mindfulness will often say, oh, but it's really just being in an experience. It's not mindfulness. I'm like, well, hang on. It's not an either or.
Right.
Those are both contributing factors. And programs where you have a teacher, and there's been research on this, a well-trained teacher, more so trained than experienced. Part of that is how you connect with the participants in the program. And if they get that, you're going to blow things out of the water. And I've seen that. I just got metrics from a program that's not MBSR, much a lighter weight, accessible program that I do at work. And the proof of concept we did with that had, nothing lower than a 93 in net promoter score or program approval or teacher approval or any of that. And they're like, well, maybe that's a fluke. Let's run it again a couple times. We just got those results, and it's hundreds across the board.
Wow.
So seeing that, and that's established on, of course, the work of the participants, the relationship they have in how we would connect, because this is interactive. And it's interactive because that's where the richness of one's exploration of life comes in.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. Yeah, and that's helpful, to hear as well. Yeah. So that was incredibly exciting, and it was kind of like it takes us, out of the realm of the anecdotal, as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so, but yeah, I mean, it's just like all the time students were talking about my very first class, a woman who'd been suffering from, some sort of abdominal issue for a year, right? She comes back in the second class, it's gone, and so it's that, like, I don't feel I'm not having that issue anymore. And it's kind of like, that's the kind of thing that happens all the time, and so, for me, kind of, I remember one of the students was, I'm asking her we're going to do a breath, awareness of breath. And she's like, I can't breathe deeply, because it's too traumatic for me. And so I was like, okay, there's other anchors. The next week, by happenstance, I happened to hear that, oh yeah, no, that was great. She kind of moved the ball within a week,
Yeah.
So that she could do that. But yeah.
Thank you, John. So I'm curious. I do want to ask, what are some of the things that you would like to see that maybe haven't happened yet in this territory of mindfulness? What are some of the things when you look at, gosh, in 10 years, what I would like to see different? What are some of those things that are rolling around in your head and heart?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So this, to see this sort of experiment, this sort of like BIPOC cohort that we did, for that to kind of become something that is like embedded within our programs, that there really is this effort across the board to greater reflect. I mean, the societies that we're doing this work in. So that would be, first off, so that, and we're not there right yet. And so the Catali Foundation is very, very interested in this, and that's wonderful. But for this to be something that becomes embedded within the various leadership organizations that are doing mindfulness, so that we can better reflect, the world, to continue to see these programs and the ones that are like this, that are so solid. And, there's been decades of study, right? So that it is based on science as well as experience, to see this, become that much more into the awareness of the various communities that were there, so that we can offer things that in 8 weeks, can really assist people. I mean, if it can be as effective as it was, with the gun violence group, then I don't know who it. I mean, these are the people that are from any of the big shootings, right? That were like, that we're aware of. I mean, they were represented in that class, and they were able to move very well through that. And so it just, another sort of way in which, this can be effective. Interestingly, the conversation with John Kabat-Zinn, and you picked me, and I was so thrilled, to be speaking to John Kabat-Zinn, who's just a regular guy, but at the same time, like, Like he's the one that coined the phrase. He's the one that's a kind of like, this has gone all over the world, in one form or fashion. Unfortunately, I think some of it gets diluted along the way, right? I mean, but interesting in John's conversation, he was talking about, um, non-dual kind of like expressions, for example, right? And I was kind of struggling with that because it's like, as Hugh O'Doherty, like Beth's partner, talks about and taught in our TTI, and maybe our ATTI as well. It's like you are here to help people with reducing their stress, right? This is stress reduction, right? And so it's like, that's my focus here, right? I mean, that's primarily what we're doing, and the other things along the way. But then to hear John talk about, this movement being more than that, right? It being kind of like a vehicle for awakening, in a way, from what I was kind of understanding. And I was like, that's not in the textbook, right? Necessarily. So that, like his desire to kind of like really to move society in that kind of way, I'm kind of, interested to see, what he has in mind, for that. And along those lines, what's interesting with this pandemic is the availability of different things. And so I started studying with Locke Kelly, right?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And so because of the glimpses, kind of blew my mind, right? And I was like, wow, this is really interesting territory. And so, and that is, that direct path, is without bones, like being, being non-dual oriented, right? And so it's like, oh, and it's, so I've been having very interesting sort of experiences with that. And then some of my other colleagues are now kind of reading, Locke Kelly. And so it's opened me up to some of these other non-dual teachers. And so if, John Kabat-Zinn is interested in that, I'm like, well, how are we going to more explicitly express this, within this community as well? So that's interesting kind of like thing.
Yeah. It's fascinating, this connection between the idea of non-duality, and even that is not an adequate way to describe right. it, but non-duality with still the lived world experience of racism,
right,
poverty, and all the rest of it, and how might a non-dual way of thinking help with changing those conditions, because those are also very real. And I think that is one of the fundamental uniquenesses of how mindfulness is in programs like MBSR, knowing that there are different definitions, different ways mindfulness is in the world in different kinds of settings, that here it's not one that's about avoidance, suppression, escape,
right,
but about engagement with what is here. And that itself is an endless source of exploration and learning, and how what we are finding can help shift what it is we're exploring in the first place.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, it's, I have a very brief history of teaching mindfulness, but how it's changed, since 2018, as we were dealing with people's, stressors that were very individually oriented, right?
Right.
And then with, other people that have other concerns, one of my first most diverse class was with my colleague, bringing Richmond public school teachers, making that available. And so all of a sudden, for primarily white classes, half my class or more are from the public school district, various ways. And it was decidedly different because the stressors were decidedly different.
Yeah.
And so, and then with all the awareness of what's happening, instead of coming from an individual, which is definitely there, but like, societies, various issues now being identified as stressors, right? And so, are these tools that can affect this? I genuinely believe that they can, address those things that I was concerned with before I discovered that spirituality is kind of my core base. Those things that were, primarily on my mind, of injustice, of racial and class, and all the rest of that, I believe, can also be addressed. And I, one memory and that comes up, um, is the 2016 election, right? And I sat up with a friend of mine who's a film director, and we're just kind of like all night kind of deal. Finally, at 3:30 in the morning, it's like, okay, you know, our new president is going to be this person we didn't want there, and how troubling that is. But what our conclusion, he has a Buddhist sort of influence in his life, is like what needs to happen is a deep spiritual initiative, change, something that is holistic, whole body and mind, spirit. Um, that is what's going to help us move into another stage, right? And so I think the potential is there. Um, I don't know where we're going to be. I mean, it's a great question to ask in 10 years. Boy, oh boy. I mean, my goodness. Um, the places where we can be, considering how so many things are accelerating as well. Um, Richmond, as you know, has become my home, and to see Monument Avenue change. So all those generals, from the Civil War era, they're all gone. They're all gone. And even their bases are now becoming gone, as well. I never thought I would live to see that happen, right?
Yeah, I think this is one of the ways in which mindfulness can help contribute to that change is that, well, first, it is as you, once that box is open, you can no longer unsee.
Right.
And more, especially the past few years, with the way things have been in the world and here in the US, an inability to not see these tensions that they were never gone. We were
Right.
never in a space where, we did it, mission accomplished. We're now this free and open society. No, we haven't been. And now this is seen. And we're no longer avoiding and suppressing the history, but that's a constant struggle there too, because the textbooks are come at their heart from one location, and that location has an iron grip on historical rewriting revisionist history and suppressing history. And more because we have opportunities like the digital age, along with, of course, its difficulties and misinformation, able to make, well, here's what really happened there. Here are the facts of this that are not open for discussion. These are the facts, and that can be validated and should be validated on your own. Absolutely. That's also part of this.
Right.
And that tension of how do we merge the again, the non-duality, the stress as stress itself, and the conditions leading to it, because if those conditions are still there, well, then we're just creating a shell
Right.
around us, and it's just a sneakier way to avoid and suppress, and it can't. But we need to still get at the roots of the causes and conditions of stress, not just in you or me or someone who's experiencing it, but what is leading to that overall
Right.
in the world. And this is one of the challenges I often find in the workplace is, oh, people are burning out. Like, well, what are the causes and conditions of that? Well, because they're getting worked up about, I don't know. What are the causes and conditions of burnout? Gallup poll, for example, Gallup did a survey. What are the things that are the conditions and of the the 6 different things I came up with, they were very directly in really conditions in the workplace, not about how I'm responding to those conditions, but conditions in the workplace. So we as mindfulness teachers can help with building resilience, not resistance, but resilience to this. How do we work with the difficulties that are there? Well, not just being okay with the difficulties when perhaps we can change those conditions.
Right.
Do that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, yeah, yeah, it's fascinating to um, the outreach to the community. And now like the various corporations and other businesses are like knocking on our door at the Inner Work Center, help,
Yeah.
these people need, my people need, they're really struggling, yada, yada. And, it's like you said, once your eyes are open and then, your comfort, you're able to kind of like have some comfort with discomfort. There is no end, right? I mean, it's like, okay, so this is a problem, and that is, and what's really needed is, revolutionary or evolutionary, right? I mean, we can't, just paper it over or just put band-aids on things. I mean, it's look around, the whole thing is a disaster, right? In many ways.
On that happy note, John, is there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners, or if there's a particular website that you could offer to them, what might that be?
Yeah. Well, there's, the Inner Work Center here in Richmond. And, where I've done most of my mindfulness work as well is University of California, San Diego's Mindfulness Center. So those could be things that could be helpful along the way. So I can point to those. Yeah.
I will have links to those for those of you who are listening on the episode page for this episode. I'll have links to those and a little bit more information about our guest today, John Taylor. John, thank you so much for being here. Good to speak with you today.
Thank you so much for having me, Ted. I really enjoyed our time. Yeah.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come and visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.